I designed this ring box to look like a Zippo lighter. All of its components were carved using my desktop CNC machine, and the sunflower on the front is filled with epoxy resin. It took a few prototypes and a couple of hours designing a custom jig to assist with CNC work holding, but in the end, I think it turned out pretty great. Stick around if you want to build one yourself. I'm Justin, and welcome back to Aquavita Woodworks. Before I start building the final version, I want to show you some of the things I like and dislike about this prototype, starting with a dislike on how big and blocky it is. Here's a 3D rendering showing a side-by-side comparison between the first version and what the final version should end up looking like. Not only will the length and width be much shorter, but its thickness is going to shrink from about 1 1/8 all the way down to just shy of 3/4 inch. That adjustment by itself should make this look a lot more like a lighter. Another thing that I dislike is how the logo on the front came out. The customer that ordered this asked for a sunflower, but I think that we can make it look a whole lot nicer by using epoxy instead of paint. Carving small components on a CNC often makes things a little bit more complicated, and since we're shrinking this down, this sunflower is going to be extremely tiny. I didn't even know that they made bits this small, but in order to carve details, I bought this 1/32 inch downcut bit. It's just so tiny. As for things that I like about this prototype, the magnets and barrel hinges I used seem to work pretty well. The magnets are 10mm in diameter, but for the final version, I'll shrink them down to 6mm to account for the change in thickness. The barrel hinges I'll keep the same, but I'll need to make some adjustments to the size of the hole they slide into just to make sure that it's a tight fit. Down below in the video description, you'll find links to both these magnets and barrel hinges right next to the full CNC build plans for this project. If you don't have a need for a ring box, I also sell build manuals for various games, holiday projects, and decorations. You should check them out. With my design settled, I can now get started on making the new jig that will assist with work holding. This jig has 2 holes in the top, one for each side of the ring box, but the new version will have 4 holes, allowing me to make 2 boxes at once. This just makes things a bit more efficient if you ever decide to make more of these down the road. If you wanted to, you could totally scale that up and make as many of these at once as you wanted, but I really just don't have a need for it. After I carve the sunflower and fill it with epoxy, I'll cut my pieces down to size so that they fit perfectly into these holes. That way, when the machine is carving the pockets for the hardware and ring, nothing will move around. If you look at both sides of this jig, you'll see a small hole on the side. Because it's so tall, the clamps I use to secure things to my wasteboard wouldn't be able to reach the top. Cutting a small pocket out from the side lets me use the clamps I normally would on other CNC projects without making any adjustments. In order to make the jig, I milled down this piece of 1-inch pine to 12 by 7.5 inches. The toolpaths that I assigned to carve it are all based on the 3D model that I designed in SketchUp and then exported as a DXF file into Carbide Create. Because my design consists of 3 separate components, I can align them with wooden dowels after they're carved and then glue them together. Carving through 1-inch thick material is much easier than carving through 3-inch material. Work smarter, not harder. With a 1/4 inch and 1/8 inch downcut bit, I assign a series of pocket and contour toolpaths to machine out all of the components. If you want to know the specific depths, check the free PDF build manual in the link in the video description. After about 45 minutes, I'm ready to move on to the next step of the process. Once my components are carved, I can remove the tabs using a multi-tool. To glue them together, I just line up the 1/4 inch dowel and hammer them into place. One note here is that when you clamp them together, make sure to clean up any glue squeeze out, because if they're inside the holes, it's going to affect the ability of the components to be secured there later on. With the glue dry, I went ahead and flush cut my dowels and tabs, making sure that all 4 sides of this jig are perfectly straight. Because we need to align it up to the CNC later, that's extremely important. I also used some 120 grit sandpaper to sand the inside of the pockets just to make sure that our ring box components would slide in a bit easier during the next step. Speaking of, now that this is finished, let's go work on our sunflower. I already went ahead and cut down this piece of 3/4 inch thick walnut to 6 3/4 inch in length by 2 inches in width. You'll notice that the size of this doesn't quite allow it to fit into our jig, and that's totally on purpose. After we carve our logo and fill it with epoxy, we're going to shave this down so that it becomes a perfect fit. Inside Cardboard Create, and using the same stock sizes as my piece of walnut, I laid out where my components will eventually be cut from. Then I imported an SVG of a sunflower that I liked and started to design the toolpaths using a 16th inch downcut bit and that super tiny 1/32 inch bit I mentioned earlier. The customer also requested a specific date be included, so I added that to the top of the box as well. Both of these toolpaths will be pockets at 0.06 inch depth, but the 16th inch downcut bit should do most of the removing of material, and the 1/32 will just come back after to clean everything up. I do have to say that I'm pretty nervous about how fragile this is, so let's see how this goes. I have to say I'm pretty happy with how that bit performed, even if it took a little longer than I may have liked. You probably noticed that on the second box up here I added a rose and a different date. This will be a gift from my wife, so that's our wedding anniversary. I already went ahead and sprayed a heavy coat of lacquer onto the top of this to help with any bleed out that may happen once I pour my epoxy. With the lacquer dry, I'm now ready to head to my epoxy station, aka my basement, to start mixing up some colors. I'm using tabletop epoxy from Total Boat, which is a 1-to-1 mix ratio, but just make sure you follow the directions on whatever brand you choose to use. With my epoxy thoroughly mixed, I then separated it into different solo cups and added color pigment powder to each one to make the colors that I wanted to use for this project. I then used my stir sticks to slowly drizzle in the epoxy into the corresponding pockets on our project, which is where you'll start to notice our first mistake. If you look at our sunflower, specifically the copper and yellow, you'll notice that they're starting to mix together. And that's because I didn't level my workpiece before getting started because, well, I was in a rush. What this means is that when I came back the next day to sand everything down using my drum sander, my sunflower just looked like crap. I ended up having to fix this by carving a whole new piece, minus the rose that I added earlier because that came out pretty okay. And then re-added my epoxy, this time making sure to level everything before I did so. So after that was cured a few days later, I sanded that down using the drum sander and everything looks a whole lot nicer. Now that at least one of my sunflowers looks good, I can start getting ready to carve the pockets for our barrel hinges and magnets. In order to do that, the first step is to slowly trim down the thickness until it matches the holes in our jig, and then do the same thing to the sides. I want to make sure that this is an extremely tight fit, so I really take my time to make sure that I'm working it down to the right dimensions. Once I knew I could hammer them into place using a mallet, I cut them down to size using the cut sheet that's laid out in the build manual. With everything cut to the right size, I hammered them into our jig and made sure that I still had material sticking out the top so I could surface it down with the CNC. I then clamped the jig onto my wasteboard and set the Z0 height by using the old school paper method, since the touch probe I normally use wouldn't fit due to the height of the jig. My X and Y are preset because of the fence that I have on my wasteboard, and I'll link a video right here if you want to see how I made that. They're extremely useful, and I recommend them to everyone that has a hobby CNC machine. Using a 1/4 inch and 1/8 inch downcut bit, I'll run a quick surfacing toolpath before carving pockets into the top of our components. The measurements for these holes were taken directly from the hardware, so if you decide to make this project, make sure that you use the same parts or just remeasure your holes. Once done carving, I popped the components out of the jig by hammering a dowel through the holes in the bottom, and so far everything is looking pretty damn good. And speaking of things that look good, yes, I got a haircut, and I am ready to show you how to finish these ring boxes. The first thing I ended up doing was installing my hardware by using CA glue for the magnets after making sure the polarity was correct, and then inserting the barrel hinges after lining them up straight and securing them into place using the set screw. Once the two halves were lined up, I sanded everything up to 320 grit sandpaper and then used a dime to make some rounded corners. I sanded that material into the right shape using my spindle sander before heading over to my router table to use a 1/8 inch roundover bit to round the edges. Now I have to say to do this at your own risk because of the fact that these will open if you hit them wrong on the router table. They're also really small, so having your fingers that close to the bit is kind of sketchy. Use a push block if you want. I just felt comfortable with my hands, but I can be an idiot sometimes. I ended up keeping all of my fingers, which allowed me to then add some Danish oil using a rag while being careful around the hinges so I didn't get any oil inside of that component. And what we're left with is a pretty cool ring box. The last thing I need to do to finish this off is add some kind of liner into the middle of these to hold a ring. I ended up taking a piece of felt and cutting it down to the same width as the hole, and then folding it into an M shape before sewing the bottom shut and inserting it into the box. This ended up working, but keep in mind I have no idea how to sew, so if you find a better solution to this, maybe using velvet or some kind of other foam, go at it. This just works for me. At the end of the day, here is the final result, and I think that my customer is going to be extremely happy. If you made it this far in the video, I appreciate you sticking around, and as always, if you have any questions or suggestions on how to do this process better, leave a comment down below. See you next time.